used to believe that the hardest part of growing old was losing the people you love. But now I know. It's realizing the ones who are still alive have already let you go. When my husband, Harold, passed away 3 years ago, I felt my world dim. We had built a modest, warm life. A small brick house, a garden full of tulips, and 50 years of quiet companionship. I thought I'd live out my days there, among the memories we made. But grief makes you vulnerable, and loneliness makes you foolish. My son, David, came to me after the funeral, his voice wrapped in concern. "Mom," he said, "you shouldn't be alone in that big house. Come live with us. You'll have the kids around, Clara can take care of you. You'll be safe." Safe. That word was my undoing. I sold my house, packed my clothes, my husband's journal, and a few photo albums, and moved into David's 2-story home in the suburbs. At first, it felt comforting. The laughter of my grandchildren filled the air, and Clara seemed genuinely kind, always asking if I wanted tea or needed help with my knitting. I told myself I was lucky. But slowly, small things began to change. My room, once called the guest suite, became the storage room. Boxes appeared in the corner. My rocking chair was moved to the garage. My meals were served after everyone else had eaten. Clara said it was just easier that way. Then there were the whispers. "She's getting forgetful," Clara would tell David, just loud enough for me to hear. She left the stove on again. She lied one morning. I hadn't even cooked that day. David would just sigh, eyes filled with irritation instead of warmth. "Mom, you need to be more careful. You're not young anymore." I bit my tongue and smiled. I told myself they were just stressed, busy, tired. But deep down, something in me began to crack. The grandchildren stopped visiting my room. My books were boxed up without asking. Clara changed the house Wi-Fi password and said it was for the kids' safety. I became invisible in my own son's home. A ghost who washed dishes, folded laundry, and thanked people who no longer looked her in the eye. One afternoon, I overheard Clara on the phone. "She's old, David. We can't keep doing this. She's going to fall or forget something important. Maybe it's time we think about other arrangements." Other arrangements. The words slithered through my heart like poison. When I told David I could still take care of myself, he smiled the way people smile at children. "Of course, Mom," he said. But his eyes were cold. I started noticing other things, too. Late-night arguments behind closed doors, bills hidden in drawers, phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. I didn't understand all of it, but I wrote things down. I always have. Harold used to say I had a memory sharper than any camera. Still, I tried to be grateful. Every night, I'd sit by my window, looking at the stars, whispering to Harold, "They'll come around. They're just worried." But as the weeks passed, my hope faded into a heavy silence. The laughter I once loved turned into murmurs of impatience. My presence became an inconvenience. And I began to wonder, when did love become a burden? When did my years of sacrifice turn into something they wanted to manage, not cherish? I didn't know it then, but the night that question burned in my heart was the beginning of my awakening, and the beginning of their end. It was a Thursday night, cold, quiet, and heavy with the kind of silence that feels planned. I had just finished folding the laundry, the ache in my back reminding me that 75 years doesn't come without its toll. The house felt strange that evening, too still. Even the ticking clock in the hallway sounded nervous. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the edge of the bed. The light in the hallway was still on. I could hear muffled voices downstairs, David and Clara, but I told myself it was nothing. They'd been arguing a lot lately, always about money, bills, and something about documents. But that night, their voices weren't raised. They were hushed, dangerous in their softness. I leaned closer to the door, holding my breath. Clara's voice came first, clear and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Tomorrow, we'll lock her away. It's time." I froze. My cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I barely heard it. My heart pounded against my ribs like it wanted to escape before I could. I waited for David to speak, to defend me, to laugh and say, "Don't be ridiculous." But he didn't. Instead, his voice came, tired and cold. "Do what you think is best." Those words broke me more than any argument could have. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. They were planning to send me away. To a home. To lock me up and throw away the key like I was some piece of furniture taking up too much space. My mind spun. Flashes of all the years I had worked. The nights I stayed awake when David had fevers. The sacrifices I made to give him the life he wanted. And this was my thank you. I waited until their voices faded. Then sat in the dark, trembling. The walls of that house suddenly felt like a cage. Every photo on the wall mocked me. Fake smiles, forced family dinners, empty affection. But beneath the fear, something else began to grow. A spark. A small, quiet fury that I hadn't felt in years. They thought I was weak. They thought I was old, fragile, harmless. They had forgotten who I was. At midnight, I turned on the small lamp by my bedside and took out my old leather bag, the one Harold had bought me on our 50th anniversary. I began to pack. A few clothes, Harold's journal, my identification papers, the small box of savings I'd hidden under the lining of my suitcase. I had always kept it for emergencies. I guess betrayal qualifies. Before leaving, I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out the small notebook I'd been keeping. Every odd phone call, every suspicious bank transaction I'd overheard, every detail Clara had tried to hide. I had written it all down, not because I planned revenge then, but because I had a habit of remembering things people hoped I'd forget. I slipped on my coat and quietly made my way downstairs. The house was silent, the air thick with deceit. The moonlight poured through the window, and I caught my reflection. An old woman with tired eyes, but not defeated ones. At the door I paused. My hands trembled as I turned the knob. The night air was cold, biting, real. I stepped out slowly, closing the door behind me as softly as I could. Each step away from that house felt like shedding years of weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. As I reached the end of the street, I looked back once. The lights in the window flickered, and I thought I saw movement. Maybe Clara checking to see if I was asleep. I smiled faintly. Let her look. Let her think I'm still there, tucked away in silence. By the time morning came, the room would be empty. And I'd be gone. Carrying not only my bag, but every secret they thought I was too old to notice. The bus rumbled through the dark countryside, its old engine humming like a lullaby for lost souls. I sat near the window, clutching my leather bag as though it were life itself. The streetlights blurred into streaks of gold as tears welled in my eyes. I didn't cry for what I'd lost. I cried because I finally understood that my son was gone long before that night. By dawn, I reached the small town where my old friend, Helen, lived. She had been my neighbor decades ago, sharp-minded, kind-hearted, and by some twist of fate, a retired lawyer. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in shock. "Margaret? Good heavens, what happened to you?" I told her everything. Every whisper, every lie, every cruel look that had slowly stripped me of my dignity. When I finished, she said nothing for a while. Then, in that calm, determined tone I remembered from our younger days, she said, "Then it's time we remind them who they're dealing with." Helen gave me a warm meal, a spare room, and, more importantly, a sense of purpose. Over the next few days, I began piecing together everything I knew about David and Clara's hidden life. You see, when you live quietly in a house long enough, you hear things. You see things. You learn to notice what others ignore. I remembered Clara's late-night phone calls, her hushed voice saying things like, "Transfer it before the audit," and "No, he doesn't know." I remembered the envelopes of cash that arrived every few weeks, always labeled charity funds. I remembered David's panicked tone when he said, "If Mom ever talks to the bank, we're finished." At the time, I hadn't understood it all. But Helen did. "They've been laundering money," she said, flipping through the notes I'd written. "Using David's company and a fake charity under Clara's name. And from what you've heard, it's a lot of money." I stared at the pages, my handwriting trembling on each line. "So that's why they wanted me gone." Helen nodded slowly. "You were in the way. You knew too much." It hit me then. They hadn't just wanted me out of their house. They'd wanted me silent. We spent days building a careful plan. Helen helped me organize my notes, print out online documents, and gather the evidence we needed. I mailed copies of everything, anonymously, to the Financial Crimes Division, the tax office, and even a local journalist known for uncovering corporate fraud. Each envelope felt like a small piece of my soul being reclaimed. When the first headlines appeared 2 weeks later, I was sitting by the window of Helen's cottage sipping tea. The morning paper read, "Local business under investigation for fraud, charity funds missing." David's company name was printed in bold letters. I folded the paper neatly, a calm smile tugging at my lips. I didn't feel triumph, only justice. Over the next few days, the dominoes fell. Accounts were frozen. Investigators arrived. Clara's fake charity was exposed, and David's partners began distancing themselves. On the news, I saw him standing outside his office, trying to look composed, his once proud face now pale and aged. He had always said I was the one losing my mind. Yet there he was, losing everything he'd built on lies. Helen looked at me from across the table and said softly, "You didn't destroy them, Margaret. You just stopped protecting them." That night, as I wrote in Harold's journal, I realized how true that was. I had spent my whole life shielding my son from the consequences of his choices, from scraped knees to unpaid debts. But not anymore. This time, the truth was his to face. And for the first time in years, I slept soundly, not as a mother betrayed, but as a woman who had finally remembered her own strength. It was early spring when I returned to the city. The air smelled of rain and regret, and the cherry trees were just beginning to bloom, soft pink petals falling like little confessions from the sky. I hadn't planned to come back, but something inside me needed to see it for myself. The end of what had once been my family, my home. My whole reason for breathing. I stood across the street from David's house, my son's house, though it no longer looked like the place I'd once called home. The shutters were closed tight. The lawn, once perfectly trimmed, had gone wild. A for sale sign leaned crookedly in the front yard, the edges frayed from wind and time. I heard they'd moved out a month ago. David and Clara were facing charges, fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. Their faces had been splashed across newspapers and online articles. The mighty Ellis family name, the one Harold had built with decades of hard work, now dragged through the mud by their own greed. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just watched. A part of me still wanted to remember David as the little boy who used to run through the sprinklers, laughing with his hair sticking to his forehead. I wanted to remember Clara as the young woman who had once baked me an apple pie when I first moved in. But those people were gone long before I escaped that house. What stood in their place were two hollow souls, obsessed with money, status, and control. I walked closer, my cane tapping softly against the pavement. The window I used to sit beside, where I'd watch the grandchildren play, was cracked. I could almost see my reflection in it. An old woman, small but unbroken, standing where she had once been invisible. As I stood there, a neighbor recognized me. Mrs. Patel, from next door, hurried over, her eyes wide. "Margaret, you're safe. We thought, well, Clara said you'd been moved to a nursing home." I smiled faintly. "They said many things, Mrs. Patel. Not all of them true." She hesitated. "You know, they didn't last long after you left. Police came almost every day. They tried to act innocent, but..." She lowered her voice. "Everyone knew." I nodded. Truth has a way of finding its own path. Later that afternoon, I visited the town's lawyer's office. Helen had already arranged everything. The old documents from the sale of my house, the ones David had insisted I sign when I moved in, had a hidden clause he hadn't noticed. Helen discovered it. He had never fully transferred the ownership of certain family shares, the last piece of my husband's estate. It meant that the house David and Clara lived in, the house I'd been thrown out of, was technically mine. When Helen told me, I laughed, a dry, incredulous laugh that shook the dust off years of silence. "I don't want it back," I'd said then. "Let the bank have it. Let the world see what greed costs." So now, standing there, I didn't feel like reclaiming property. I had already reclaimed something far more precious, my dignity. As the sun began to set, I turned and walked away. My cane clicked against the pavement like a clock marking the rhythm of freedom. I now live by the sea, in a small white cottage with blue shutters. The mornings smell of salt and roses, and I spend my days writing in Harold's journal, letters he'll never read, stories I'll never tell anyone but him. Sometimes I see children playing by the shore, and I smile. Not every family breaks, some still know what love means. Every evening, I write the same line at the bottom of the page. My small reminder of the night I chose myself over fear. They tried to lock me away, but they only freed me. I used to think old age meant waiting quietly for the end. Now I know. It means living long enough to see the truth rise from the ashes. And as the waves crash gently outside my window, I whisper to the wind, "Harold, I made it out. And I finally came home."